Hello and welcome to BCM325 Future Cultures. In this lecture, we conclude our module on cyberculture with episode 4 of 4, in which we will explore the concept of cyberspace. The future of cyberspace has a trajectory that goes in multiple overlapping directions, especially when you think about the technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality. But cyberspace is more than VR and AR. Cyberspace is a type of reality, one that is grounded in the everyday experiences of much more ubiquitous technologies like mobile screens, personal computers, and internet routers. This is the overlooked cyberspace, the cyberspace in which you are entirely immersed in, but rarely register unless something goes wrong. Then you become acutely attuned to the problems of dead batteries, hard drives, cables, and of course, lack of Wi-Fi signals. Remember way back in the first lecture in this series when we described cyberculture as the social conditions that emerge from the use of computer networks for communication, entertainment, and business, as well as other things like education and healthcare. Yes, cyberspace can mean impressive new virtual reality and augmented reality technologies, and we are going to discuss both of these technologies in this lecture. But I want to emphasize and explore the point that cyberspace is also merely the physical and cognitive environment in which networked communications are overlaid onto our everyday existence and actually come to form that existence. Cyberspace is very much like the experience of bad mobile phone connections or internet servers that go out when it rains. Cyberspace is the ability to be tracked in real time via your phone's GPS signal. The term cyberspace was coined by William Gibson in his short story from 1982 called Burning Chrome. The concept was later developed in the 1984 novel Neuromancer, in which Gibson writes, "Cyberspace, a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation. A graphic representation of data abstracted from banks of every computer in the human system. Unthinkable complexity. Lines of light ranged in the non-space of the mind, clusters and constellations of data, like city lights receding." Focus on the imagery here for a moment, especially the line, lines of light ranged in the non-space of the mind. Gibson isn't really talking about the simulation of what we might call Euclidean space, which is the representation of three-dimensional space, like what we see in video games. Gibson's cyberspace is not a human space. It is a visual representation of informational space, of computer space. The conceptual space of digital networks and databases, of distributed systems, of pure code that is populated with the clusters and constellations of data, like city lights receding. This kind of cyberspace is therefore a different kind of space, one that represents the relationship between different types of information and forms of communication. Science fiction author and futurist Bruce Sterling wrote in the introduction to the book The Hacker Crackdown in 1992 that cyberspace is the place where a telephone conversation appears to occur, not inside your actual phone, the plastic device on your desk, not inside the other person's phone in some other city, the place between the phones, the indefinite place out there where the two of you, two human beings, actually meet and communicate. Though it is not exactly real, cyberspace is a genuine place, writes Bruce Sterling. These things that have very genuine consequences. This place is not real in the traditional sense, but it is serious, it is earnest. Tens of thousands of people have dedicated their lives to it, to the public service of public communication by wires and electronics. Remember, he's writing back in 1992. This is an important distinction because Sterling is arguing that cyberspace is more than just virtual reality. He's also suggesting that cyberspace is actual. The space in cyberspace is a metaphor to help us think about the relationship between electronic, digital, physical, and network connections and their implications. Cyberpunks use the concept of cyberspace in the same way that Vannevar Bush used the concept of the memex, and Ted Nelson imagined the concepts of hypertext and hypermedia. The cyberpunks use the concept of cyberspace as a means for better understanding the possibilities brought into being by the new network relations between humans, information, and computational machines, which expand the possibilities of thought and being and suggest new ways to generate knowledge and experiment creatively. Through these ideas, we see how cyberspace is virtual, and we can begin to unpack the relationship between virtuality and reality. The concept of virtuality is part of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze's work, and he was actually building on another philosopher, Henri Bergson. In very, very brief terms, Deleuze deployed the term virtual to describe an aspect of reality that may not have an actuality, but can still be thought of as being real. Take memory, for example. Bergson and Deleuze used writer Marcel Proust's understanding of memory as something that is very real, but not actual. Memory is ideal, but it is not abstract. So the virtual may exist only on the surface, like a memory or a projection, like a photograph on a screen. And so it may not exist in actuality, as if looking through a window, but it still has a reality for the viewer. It still has real meaning. Take Mario and Peach. These characters don't actually exist. In the game, they are computer code. They are photons on the screen. They can be made material in toys and other paratexts, but they are not actual people, although they are actual characters. They are nonetheless real because they can be interacted with and have meaning for players of the game. So Deleuze suggests that virtual is not opposed to the real, but rather virtual is at the opposite spectrum of the actual. So when you win Mario Kart, you are really winning Mario Kart, but you are not actually go-kart racing. This might sound like some annoying semantics, but it is a fundamental concept that goes a long way to help explaining why virtual reality is so appealing as an idea, but mostly limited in terms of how successful it has been as a technology and consumer experience. The term virtual reality was first used in the book The Judas Mandala, a 1982 novel by Australian science fiction author Damien Broderick, although virtual reality is also a phrase that was suggested around the same time by computer scientist and visual artist Jaron Lanier. Lanier was referring to an environment that can translate information into a visual simulation that the human body can then move through without moving, to affect or have an essence without an actuality. So, virtual reality has many origins, including a long-standing art practice associated with optical illusions and panoramic interfaces, like the murals that began to appear in Italy in the 1560s. Baldassare Peruzzi was an Italian artist and architect who painted incredible frescoes featuring grand open balconies complete with city-side and countryside views. To quote the Web Gallery of Art, in the Sala del Prospettive, on the upper story of the Villa Farnesia, Peruzzi revived the perspective schemes of Melozzo di Fori and Mantegna, apologies for the mispronunciations of those names, possibly under the influence of both. The perspective was planned to function correctly when the observer is standing towards the left of the room. Peruzzi had designed a splendid architecture of dark, veined marble columns with gilded capitals that incorporated the actual veined marble doors in the frame. The frescoed architecture is so precisely painted that it is almost impossible to distinguish where the real marble ends and the illusion begins. Through the lofty columns, one looks out to a painted terrace that opens onto a continuous landscape. What's significant about these frescoes is the creation of the virtual reality bubble. The VR bubble is the virtual space that occurs around the perceiver's body when they wear the headset. It is the idea of the screen wrapped around the viewer's eyes, thus enclosing them in a virtual space that is simultaneously real and virtual, but not actual. In the 20th century, virtual reality technologies appear in cycles. The notion of accessing virtual reality through a set of goggles worn on the head was popularized by the writer Stanley G. Weinbaum in his short fiction called Pygmalion Spectacles, first published in 1935. He proposed a hypothetical design for a set of goggles that would display a type of holographic recordings of fictional experiences. There are several audiobook versions of this short story on YouTube that are worth a listen. Definitely check it out if you're interested in the history of VR technologies, especially how VR and other futuristic technologies have been imagined in the past. Morton Hellig was an American pioneer cinematographer who became famous in the 1950s for his invention of the sensorama, described as the cinema of the future, an experience theater which attempted to include different senses in the cinematic experience by expanding the view to encompass the individual audience and involve them in on-screen activity. Hellig also invented a 3D camera, and he made 5 films to demonstrate the sensorama's capabilities, including a helicopter, go-kart, bicycle, and motorbike ride experience that included vibrations in the seat and even scent dispensers to suggest different locations. Although remarkable, given the technology available at the time, the sensorama was not a commercial success, and this becomes something of a pattern with the history of VR. In 1968, Ivan Sutherland and his student Bob Spruill created the Sword of Damocles. This was both an augmented reality, virtual reality headset and mounted display system, which is somewhat similar to Morton Hellig's other invention, the Telesphere mask, patented in 1960. The Sword of Damocles includes a user interface which could project a 3-dimensional wireframe display on the glasses that were worn by the user, which would then appear to be present in the room in front of the user. The device was named because of the Greek myth in which the king Dionysius hangs a sword over his throne, held in place by a single horse's hair. In commenting to the king of his good fortune, Dionysius invites Damocles to sit on the throne. Damocles quickly comes to realize that the message of the sword is that with great fortune and power comes great danger. In 1990, Jonathan Weldon, a VR PhD, demonstrated virtuality at an exhibition staged at London's Alexandra Palace. His garage setup company would go on to produce the Virtuality as a line of virtual reality gaming machines that could be found in video arcades, adventure parks, and some game stores in the early to mid 1990s. I remember playing these multiplayer games at around the same time that I first read Neuromancer in 1992. The VR machines delivered an almost real-time VR experience, at least less than 50 milliseconds lag, and gaming occurred by stepping up into these podiums and wearing these very large, very heavy stereoscopic visors. You had the connected kind of joystick controller, and the podiums were even networked, so you could play multiplayer games, which was amazing at the time. Unfortunately, these systems cost around $73,000 US pod. The headsets were very cumbersome, even though they did provide the kind of first immersive VR experiences. And again, they were too expensive and to purchase and maintain. One of the most famous, or infamous VR devices, was created by Nintendo and released in Japan in North America in 1995. The Virtual Boy used an eye-splitting red monochrome display and relied on a parallax effect to create an illusion of depth. There were 22 games made for the device, but its reputation for nauseating and headache-inducing gameplay and its very high cost meant that the system sold very poorly and is now really only remembered in the memes. Frustrated with the lack of commercially available virtual reality options, Palmer Luckey invested in collecting as many different VR devices as he could and began creating a prototype of his own device in his parents' garage in 2010 when he was just 17. His prototype featured a headset that successfully included a 90-degree field of view. Luckey went on to develop a series of prototypes over 10 months, increasing the range to a 270-degree field of view, while also decreasing the size and weight. The sixth iteration was known as the Rift, and he started his company Oculus VR to facilitate the Kickstarter campaign in 2012, in which 9,522 backers pledged USD $2,437,429. In 2014, Facebook acquired Oculus VR for a reported USD $3 billion. And in 2017, Luckey was actually fired from Oculus. He went on to create Anduril Industries, a defense technology company producing autonomous drones and remote sensors. As of 2020, Oculus's major competitor is the HTC Vive, which was co-developed by HTC and games publisher Valve. And both companies continue to improve and expand on their commercial products. These modern VR units are advanced cybernetic systems, which incorporate and enfold the human body, both its head and its hands at this stage, in order to provide feedback systems that record the position of the headset in three-dimensional space. And they use the hand controller units for input. Some of the most recent VR devices also include eye tracking software to provide the most immersive experiences possible for the user. Putting the headpiece on is very much like a mixture of putting something like Ned Kelly's helmet and Tony Stark's Iron Man visor. It's a mix of the primitive and the advanced, and a mix of the veneration and vestments of traditional types of roles and experiences that are guided by the types of clothes and devices that we wear on our body. Before we move on to augmented reality, I want to just go back to Gibson's description of cyberspace as an hallucination and suggest that while VR is real, it is a totally perceived reality. Cyberspace is vivid and substantial when we're dealing with virtual reality, but it is important to remember that it is an illusion. The Gibson quote also emphasizes that this is a consensual experience. Not only does this mean that we have individual agency, it also suggests a shared activity, that VR is not just about us individually isolating ourselves in VR bubbles, but to actually experience a real and collective and socially permitted illusion. And that is why Facebook is investing in this technology. In cyberculture, and cyberpunk particularly, cyberspace is often represented as an unbounded realm of pure potentiality, where anything that you can imagine can become a reality, at least with enough coding and graphics rendering. We see this in the Oasis in the movie Ready Player One, which was a book actually first published in 2011 by Ernest Cline, and then later a movie directed by Steven Spielberg in 2018. The Oasis, or ontologically anthropocentric sensory immersive simulation, a massively multiplayer online simulation game created in this world by James Halliday and Ogden Morrow of Gregarious Simulation Systems. The Oasis began as an online gaming platform and evolved into a globally networked virtual reality that almost all humans use every day. In the film, it has become the source of the most dominant online economy on the planet. And so it sits precisely within what Vivian Sobchak describes as the function of science fiction, which is the cognitive mapping and poetic figuration of social relations as they are constituted by new technological modes of being in the world. Cognitive mapping of virtual reality in cyberpunk is an attempt to wrestle with the significant complications that such technologies bring to the human condition. In the past, computer games and online chat have been criticized as being an attempt to escape from reality. This is a key criticism of the movie, that it is not human and socially responsible to be logged in all the time, because you would then miss out on authentic embodied experiences. This is a particularly naive perspective, especially when it is clear from the film that the reality of the world is one of poverty and a collapsing biosphere and injustice and intolerance. It is also an attempt to reinforce the ontological separation and false binary of the online and offline. This is the idea that what happens online, in games or social media and the internet, is not real and therefore has no real value or real meaning. It is an attempt to suggest that what happens physically in the workplace, in the classroom, in the nightclub, or in the outdoor world is somehow more real, more actual, and therefore more important, more valuable, and more meaningful. It is a clear attempt to separate the virtual from the real. It was true that in the early days of the internet, in which going online was seen as something that you had to choose to do, often by using a dial-up modem, the concept of cyberspace was seen as an escape from reality, and a place of anonymity, a place where you didn't have to be yourself. This is included in the idea that cyberspace was a virtual safe space, in which you could experiment in presenting your race, gender, sexuality, age, even humanity in a number of different imaginable ways. But as smartphones and broadband connections became ubiquitous, we became online all the time, and games like World of Warcraft began to connect our Facebook accounts to our online profiles. We embraced social media in our online and offline activities, and our public selves became collapsed into this more unified experience in which who we are online and who we are offline are both just examples of the different ways in which we present ourselves. It's still not one-to-one. There are plenty of online games and platforms and services where we present our best selves, or we are kind of semi-anonymous. But what happens online is still very real, as can be seen from all the different types of crimes that exist to punish people for specific behaviour online. In the UK, the police state means that you can be arrested for posting rap lyrics on an Instagram post. You can be arrested for making bad jokes on Twitter. You can be arrested for making bad jokes, full stop. In the United States, there are instances of young people being arrested for claiming in a video game that they will visit their opponent's school and kill them, or come to their house and kill their animals. So making these kinds of threats online in this virtual space is viewed by the law as being entirely actual in this sense. In Cyberpunk, like the Oasis, people's identities were rendered unstable, interchangeable, and mutable. And this is one of the classic tropes of the cyberpunk genre. But our everyday experience of cyberspace is very different. The Oasis and the cyberpunk version of cyberpunk is something of a magical nature. The idea that anything is possible in this virtual realm. And there is still something of the magic of the virtual left in our more mundane experience of cyberspace. I think this occurs particularly in the hybridity of the cyborg that exists when humans embrace the reality of the virtual. As Catherine N. Hales writes, cyberspace is created by transforming a data matrix into a landscape in which narratives can happen. The cyborg that comes into being in virtual reality games becomes what Arthur Croker and Michael Weinstein describe as the hypertexted body that can navigate both the representational space of games and the more abstracted space of information. For some, this metaphorical reality of unreality is dangerous, even blasphemous. As Danny Cavallaro writes, there is a risk of idealizing the information network space as a total conquest of humankind, a perpetuation of conventional illusions of mastery. This is certainly the case of two of my favorite tabletop game worlds that inhabit the cyberpunk genre. Shadowrun is a role-playing game which mixes cyberpunk with fantasy tropes, and Netrunner is a card game which combines themes from Blade Runner and Gibson's Neuromancer together, especially the idea of augmented humans hacking into the information matrix owned by global megacorporations. All right, let's move on to talking about augmented reality and then wrap things up. Another understanding of cyberspace is the overlay of audio-visual objects onto the physical world via augmented reality, where virtual reality produces a total enclosure within a head-mounted device, creating the 3D bubble. The cyborg that is created by augmented reality occurs through the overlay of information onto the perceived environment via many different techniques, most frequently using mobile phone devices and smartphones. Augmented reality can function at a range of different levels, and these can be seen in the Pokemon Go app. On one level, there is the ability to project the Pocket Monster onto the local environment using the phone's camera, revealing an actuality that cannot be otherwise perceived. Another level of augmented reality in the app, however, is far more recognizable, and that is the map integration. This is another type of augmented reality. This shows you where the Pokemons exist virtually in the actual world as it is represented in game via the map. This means that the Pokemon can only be revealed by using the phone like a magical talisman. Indeed, augmented reality is an ancient process in which technology attempts to replicate the conditions of magic. In his lecture, The Language of Magic, a talk for haunted machines from 2014, comic book author Warren Ellis writes that the first pair of augmented reality glasses he ever saw were the iron goggles worn by Cunning Murrell, the last of the Essex cunning men, that allowed him to see ghosts and demons superimposed on the rural landscape, and they would date back to 1825. The iPad, argues Warren, is a 21st century spellbook that doesn't have to be powered up by murdering a chicken, or other means that you will have to read or listen to his lecture to find out. Being aware of the landscapes we are in may yet become very important, because AR is just the most recent point on a millennia-old human process of dramaticizing our landscapes. A megalith or an AR anchor are essentially the same thing, something dropped on the landscape as a sign piece of information. So let's start pulling some of these threads together and bring us to a conclusion. Tony Myers writes about cyberspace in William Gibson's Neuromancer, which we talked extensively about in last week's lecture on Cyberpunks. Myers argues that cyberspace is an attempt at a postmodern cartography. That is to say, a representational strategy for domesticating what postmodernist scholar Frederick Jameson called the postmodern hyperspace. The irony of reading the form of Neuromancer as a symptom of the impossibility of negotiating the overdetermined social spaces of late capitalism is that cyberspace represents an attempt to overcome just such an impossibility in the first place. Myers is writing about William Gibson's Neuromancer, but he could just as easily be referring to Johnny Mnemonic, The Matrix, The Ghost in the Shell, or even the new Amazon series Upload, when he is suggesting that cyberspace is the merging of the individual within the symbolic network in the inscriptions of the social imaginary of late capitalism. This is why Facebook is investing in virtual reality, because this version of cyberspace represents an unlimited domain for new types of marketplace experiences, new types of commercially exploitable experiences, as well as new types of digitally networked virtual products like in-game items and economic conditions that are not limited by material conditions. Connected to Facebook and your social media presence, this new virtual reality has an enormous economic potential that is practically without limit. And this is the idea of the oasis in Ready Player One. It is not just the visual representation of cyberspace that we might associate with movies like Tron and its sequel, which map hardware and software together as anthropomorphized software programs and great majestic cityscapes. The cities of the future will expand both virtually and through augmented technologies. This is often referred to as the smart city, where new information and interactional layers are accessed by mobile technologies in the short term, but perhaps more embedded cyborg technologies in the future. We see this in the cities represented from the screenings each week in this subject. From the city of Metropolis, or the Great Space Hotel in 2001: A Space Odyssey, to the sprawling Newport City in Ghost in the Shell, or the megacity featured in The Matrix. These are not just physically imposing structures, they are the epicenters of new orders of cyberspace. They are not only the new body for the externalized human nervous system of all the wires, machines, and communication towers, they are part of the new cyborg that make the online mediaverse of cyberspace possible. Although it might be deficient in international terms, the Australian NBN makes possible the cyberspace and virtual marketplace of Disney, Amazon, Twitch, YouTube, eBay, Instagram, and so it goes on. Myers argues that for Gibson, the effects of this are even more profound. Indeed, according to Gibson, cyberspace as a concept was intended to suggest the point at which media flow together and surround us. It is the ultimate extension of the exclusion of daily life. With cyberspace, as I describe it, you can literally wrap yourself in media and not have to see what's really going on around you. As more education, work, social services, health, entertainment, and communication exists in the virtual domain of cyberspace, we get further and further away from the more utopian ideas about cyberspace that existed for many science fiction fans in the late 1980s and 1990s, when the cyberpunk genre was first offering up cyberspace as a new virtual realm of emancipation and an opportunity to move beyond the physical limitations of the body and physical space. The physical conception of space disconnects it from sense perception. Since it is perpetually present, it is absolute, not dependent on the perceptions of a human subject. From a psychological perspective, space does not have such an absolute status because it is tied to sense perception. Psychological space can change. The use of drugs, for instance, can change one's experience of space in such a way that someone may jump off a building by losing his or her sense of distance. So, for Gibson and the other cyberpunks then, cyberspace becomes a drug, right? A metaphor for helping us come to understand the shift in the sense perception and the psychological change that comes with new technologies and both their virtual and actual effects. Science fiction books, television, movies, comics, and games then provide a means for understanding the transition from what Marshall McLuhan called the electronic age to the information age and beyond in what we might call the virtual age. With Gibson, argues Myers, cyberspace becomes a metaphor for the imaginary vista of electronic networks and the experiences of communication technologies made possible by computer devices. We might call this emergent reality virtual, but the interactions and their meanings are actual. Cyberspace, especially the cyber component, carries with it an important nostalgia, with its imagining derived from the worlds of fiction and the stories we tell about its relationship to our actual experiences. Cyberspace, says Bell, sounds like the future was supposed to be. That concludes this series on cyberculture. Thank you very much for coming along for the ride, and remember, the future is now.